the idyllic villages that cling to our coastline. Known for their beauty and serenity.
Wow, look at this, just incredible.
Now destinations for our leisure.
This is like exploring a jungle.
But once they played a vital role in our history.
That's got to be the Lost Village. I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist, I'm fascinated by our coastal villages. I want to explore them, discover their history, and unearth their often surprising pasts.
I've come to Port Carlisle in Cumbria. The village sits 11 miles west of the city of Carlisle on the Solway Firth, a waterway bordering England and Scotland, leading to the Irish Sea and beyond. Today, it's a small, tight-knit coastal community, but one with an ambitious past.
In the early 1800s, this tiny village had high hopes to rival the great northern port cities.
It was the entrance to the canal from the Solway Firth. Ships up to 120 tons could get in here.
This was going to become the great port, perhaps rivaling Liverpool. That sounds crazy.
And they hoped a transport revolution would bring new prosperity to the locals.
There's a newspaper report that says there is no reason to believe that Port Carlisle will not become the most popular of the seaside coastal resorts.
So what went wrong?
There's a fascinating story to this village by the sea. Before the 1800s, Port Carlisle was known as Fisher's Cross. There were very few buildings here, and the only notable landmark was a stone cross. A few boats plied up and down the Solway Firth and across to Scotland, but that was it. However, with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution and its engineering ingenuity, this place found itself at the centre of a transport explosion, and it was believed it was destined for great things.
Most of the houses were built in the early 1800s, but there are clues to a much earlier structure that ran through the village.
I've just noticed the Hadrian's Wall path runs down in that direction. There's not much physical sign of it here that's very obvious. We haven't got great big masonry structures, but what we do have are some little clues in various buildings. There, above the door of a early 19th century building, is something much, much older. It's a Roman altar stone, and it's inscribed Matribus Suis. This is something like a dedication of soldiers to a mother goddess. There it is, a little fragment of the Roman Empire in that wall. Now over there we've got the Solway Firth, and that's Scotland on the opposite bank, and this village is called Port Carlisle, but there's certainly no port here today. There's no harbour, there's no boats out there even.
I'm wondering if the houses here can give any insight into this village's trading past.
And the main street here is made up of these terraces, these runs of houses, and they're all built in a similar style. This is the early part of the 19th century, 1810s, 20s, 30s. You can see there's various design elements that are picked up again and again and again. These lovely lace-like fan lights in the door there, just to shed a little bit of light onto the hall. Those round arches to the big front doors with the projecting keystone. There's nothing later Victorian here. There's nothing Edwardian or going into the 20th century. It's all of a piece. Late Georgian architectural style, early 19th century. You know, these are not workers' cottages. These are people that have got a bit of money. It's quite a prestigious development.
Local maps offer up clues as to how this place has changed.
Got a map of 1774 here. Where Port Carlisle is today, we've got Fisher's Cross, and that's it. There's nothing else at all. There's nothing. But got another map here of around 1860, so we're just 100 years on here. It's now known as Port Carlisle. There's about 3 or 4 dozen houses. The place has grown enormously from almost nothing. It all looks planned, designed, a development carried out in a very short period of time. And it looks as though perhaps the intention was to keep this development going. More rows of houses, more streets.
The construction of the village happened very suddenly, but I need to take a view from above to discover what funded its rapid growth. The missing port of Port Carlisle.
I'm taking my first look at the harbour here. I've got this wonderful aerial view to help me as well. And what I can see the shoreline coming down round here. Out in front of me, there's a sort of basin is being defined. It looks like it's been scoured out, deepened perhaps. And then the most incredible structure, huge sandstone blocks, forming an island out in the Solway. And here, there's another structure going out to sea. This one's wood. Nature doesn't do many straight lines, and there's a straight line here, and that's defined by this line of timbers, these jagged timbers sticking out of the mud and heading off to the centre of the Solway Firth there. These are really quite substantial timbers here. They're firmly embedded. We've got uprights here, we've got raking timbers here, bracing them. This is a really substantial structure, a platform, a jetty, something like that, heading out into the sea. And there are bits of iron all around here. This bracket here, perhaps tying all the timbers together. So it was obviously all bolted together at some point, but time and tides have taken their toll. It's now eroding away. Oh my goodness, look at this. Huge lump of granite here. It's got a massive foundation. You can imagine a huge ship's rope being tied round here as the boats were brought close to the wall. Absolutely amazing. Look at this, steps down. You can imagine perhaps a tender, a pilot boat, something like that. You could step down onto it, or perhaps one of the bigger boats. One thing's for sure, everything here is on a massive scale. This is a wharf designed to handle a lot of cargo. Huge cost, huge investment of time and money. They really meant business here.
The port was clearly impressive, but back at shore, I can see what the infrastructure here was all focused on.
You've got these huge granite blocks here, like massive wedges of cheese. Then there's big sandstone blocks here, and there's the equivalent on the other side, quite a span, and slots. Well, those would be for timbers, gates. This looks like the opening to a sluice or a canal.
This tiny village was in fact the start of the Carlisle Ship Canal. From the late 1700s, a transport revolution swept across the nation. It was the golden age of canals, a rapid development that by the 1830s created over 4,000 miles of canal network. Historian David Ramshaw has researched the story of the canal system here in Port Carlisle.
David, this looks very, very wide. When you're looking at inland canals, they're narrow. You have narrow boats, but this is wide.
It was the entrance, the sea lock to the entrance to the canal from the Solway Firth. Ships up to 120 tons could get in here. And it wasn't like a narrowboat canal. It was deep. It was 9 foot deep.
Well, who's actually funding all this, taking this punt that this was the place to be?
Well, it was the businessmen in Carlisle. By building the canal from here, they were able to take goods, particularly coal, because that was what they wanted most, all the way into Carlisle.
And coal is fueling the Industrial Revolution.
That's right, yes. And they were bringing goods in more cheaply and exporting textiles more cheaply. And they could export them straight away to the continent, direct from the city.
In 1819, the Carlisle Canal Company obtained an Act of Parliament and began building the 11.5-mile canal. It cost £80,000, nearly £10 million in today's money.
David, this looks like another set of lock gates to me. You can see the grooves where the gates used to be.
That's right.
So how many locks in total?
8.
Eight
locks.
Over 11, 12 miles?
Yes.
How long did it take to build?
It took about 3 years. The actual building didn't start till 1820. But the whole canal wasn't opened until 1823. At the actual opening day, there was something like 25,000 people descended on the canal. In the newspapers, there was something like 3 pages just full of all this sort of stuff. And it said it was the opening of the Carlisle Canal. The business of the town was wholly suspended. The shops were closed. At an early hour in the morning, the city of Carlisle was nearly deserted. The surrounding country also sent its thousands to partake of its general joy. People just could not believe what they were seeing, basically.
So this was the dawning of a new era, and not just for Port Carlisle, but for Carlisle itself.
It was indeed, yes, yeah.
By 1836, Port Carlisle is flourishing. 4,000 ships had arrived from the sea to offload their cargoes here to be taken up the canal. In 1838, in 1 month alone, 5 American timber ships had docked here. Now that was thought to be unrivalled by any port in the country at the time.
Money was flooding into the port, and the fine Georgian houses show the prosperity of the times and the wealth it gave the villagers. Alex Holmes now lives in the home owned by one of Port Carlisle's shipping magnates.
So it's a grand house. This is clearly someone who's got some means. This is someone who's living quite elegantly. It's striking that it overlooks the heart of the activity here, really.
Known locally as the Captain's House, Captain Peter Irving. He was one of the bigger names in the village. He was here for quite some time, sort of 40, 50 years, and was a ship owner.
Well, they tend to live near to where their business is at the time. They don't sort of retire to somewhere. They're overseeing their shipping, and that implies that there was a lot going on out there.
Yeah, and here we can see out over the old dock area. So from here, he'd been able to see his ships waiting for the travel up to Carlisle.
So it's right in the heart of the action here. I've made it. This is my empire, and here's my house.
You've got the servants to look after you.
So have you still got servants here today?
Unfortunately not, no. I've got servants' bells.
So you've got the bells, but when they ring, no one comes.
No one comes.
The canal brought trade through Port Carlisle, but it also created a passenger service. Now the new middle class could escape the pollution of the industrial northern towns and cities. And villagers here began to cater for these new visitors.
Well, this is a very, very grand building indeed. It stands alone. This was built as a hotel, the Solway House. Look at that grand entrance there. And there's a newspaper article here that just gives some flavour of some of the prestigious clientele. The Right Honourable Lady Arden has been sojourning a few days at the Solway Hotel, Port Carlisle, enjoying the fine sea breezes of that salubrious spot. Her ladyship was joined by her lord on Thursday when they took their departure to Northumberland. With the hotel growing a fine reputation, local businessmen saw a further opportunity to exploit the Victorian love affair with the sea. Julie Minns from the Carlisle Baths project is fascinated by Victorian tourism here in Port Carlisle. Well, this is an interesting building.
Yes.
Wow, sandstone blocks here. It's a very robust looking building. Several chimneys. And that's odd for a cottage. Big front door, almost like a display front door really. And these windows looking out beautifully onto the Solway Firth there, onto the marsh. Wonderful building. What is it?
In the 1840s, it's not a house. This is a bathhouse.
A bathhouse?
A bathhouse. This will be a private bathhouse that's built by subscription, taking advantage of the day trippers who are now using the canal to visit Port Carlisle, to enjoy the sea air, and if they don't want to go in the sea itself, they can now enjoy the sea water in one of the baths in this amazing building. It's very much tapping into the optimism that exists about Port Carlisle at that time. There's a newspaper report that says there is no reason to believe that Port Carlisle will not become the most popular of the seaside coastal resorts.
The bathhouse has been a private home for over 130 years, but there are still signs of its past. Oh, wow. This is a lofty room, isn't it? We're definitely not in a little cottage here, are we? Amazing. And look at that. There's a huge lintel there and what looks like some massive opening in the wall formerly, now been blocked up. Extraordinary.
That's absolutely right. You're standing in the boiler room of the bathhouse. And in fact, we have a picture here that shows you a huge fireplace. The lady here, we believe, was one of the bath attendants. So here she is in situ in the boiler house where we're stood right now, heating the hot water that's been piped in from the sea just across the road.
Well, how did that actually function? What was in each room?
There'd be a hot bath, there would be a cold bath, each one would have their own room. You're just filling up your bath and then spending a lovely leisurely hour or so maybe. It was very much in vogue. There were various claims made to the therapeutic qualities of seawater at the time. I mean, there's a newspaper report from the Carlisle Patriot that talks about the quality of the facilities here, that the water was wonderfully clean and filtered. So it was hugely popular because it was a quality establishment.
Not much remains of the original bathhouse workings, but Julie is keen to show me one rare find. Whoa, look at that.
This is quite the cauldron.
What a huge, great iron structure. Huge thing. So this is the hot water for the bath, basically. You're heating it up in this huge cauldron.
That's right. We've piped it from the sea into the building. If you paid for one of the hot baths, this is where your water's going to come from.
And I can see here it's got these great iron lugs on it as well, so you'd had to have suspended it. But what a weight! You'd need to suspend it from a massive beam or something like that.
Especially when it's filled with that seawater that we've drawn off the sea through the pipe into here.
Well, that explains that huge fireplace. I mean, that's not domestic, that's just not for cooking. And I can see here, look, there's a little hole here, so you can actually draw off water, you can drain it down. If I go around here, there's actually, it's like a little spout. So you can take the hot water out of here or ladle the water out to where it needs to be.
Yeah.
Isn't it incredible? I mean, very often things like this are broken up or they're recycled, they're taken miles away, they find different uses, but it's still here at the bathhouse.
Yeah, it's a wonderful piece of Port Carlisle history.
By 1845, Port Carlisle on the surface seemed to be thriving. The canal was busy and tourists brought in extra money, but change was in the air. In this period, the railway network was gaining more importance than the canals.
trains could carry more cargo and they could get to their destination faster. Rail historian Stephen White has researched the history of Port Carlisle's next step.
So Stephen, you were very specific. We had to meet in this particular car park. Why?
We're actually in Port Carlisle station. If you just look at your feet, you can see stretching along here. You're just standing on the platform edge. Over there was the station itself. Behind the hedge, which is the children's playground today, that's where the turntable was for the engine to turn round and come back towards Carlisle.
Who was behind the building of the railway here?
Well, the canal opened in 1823, but already by 1847 it was being suggested that the canal be replaced by a railway. Railways were much faster. The modern boat, which brought passengers down from Carlisle to Port Carlisle, took an hour and 40 minutes. The railway would do that journey in 35 minutes. Was there any choice? Not to the promoters' minds.
And the railways were the big new thing in a way.
Railways were the things of the future, really, and so they decided in 1853 to drain the canal, and then the railway was just laid in the bed to the destination here at Port Carlisle.
The Carlisle Ship Canal, at a cost of almost £10 million, had lasted just 30 years.
Oh, look at this. So, platform up here, we've got a drop, and we're on the track down here.
Yep, this is a track bed. It's fantastic, isn't it? Thrilling to actually put your hands on the brickwork. The workmanship is fantastic.
Port Carlisle had its speedy new trade route in place, ready for business. But it would soon face another huge challenge.
They've built the platform, they've built the station master's house, they've built the station, the engine sheds, the turntable, this huge track running down to Carlisle. Surely this is going to go on to flourish.
The railway line opened in 1854, but in 1857, the engine, the locomotive that serviced this station was withdrawn. The burghers of Carlisle were interested in developing a new port. Their attention was switched from Port Carlisle to the new port that they want to develop 8 or 9 miles away down the coast, which was Silloth. The railway to Silloth opens in 1856. Port Carlisle hasn't got a chance. This was going to become the great port, perhaps rivaling Liverpool. That sounds crazy. And this was just neglected.
Well, at least there's a remnant here, a reminder, a pretty solid reminder of the railway.
Yeah, it absolutely is, isn't it? It really speaks of a different time.
Incredibly, Port Carlisle's new steam service had lasted only 3 years.
Over down here.
In his back garden, Stephen Langfield has evidence showing what happened next to the village railway.
There was a building here, and I believe it had something to do with the railway, possibly the stable for the horse, for the dandy car.
What's a dandy car?
Well, they originally had locomotives here, but then the track proved to be too expensive to maintain for a locomotive. So the railway decided to have a one carriage hauled by a horse all the way from here up to Drumbrough.
So this is using the same rails that a steam locomotive would use, but you've just got a horse pulling the carriage.
Absolutely, yeah. It's what makes Port Carlisle very special. I've got a picture of the dandy here. This is late Victorian times. And of course, all the local kids are climbing all over to get their picture taken.
Yeah.
But there's the horse.
Fine-looking horse.
And I believe the driver was called Mr. Iverson.
And this is the only place that you're going on a horse-drawn carriage. It's not operating anywhere else.
As far as I know, that's correct, yes. First class and second class, you actually got to go inside the car. But third class, you had to sit on the outside.
Sitting in the rain.
And when, like today, with showers, you'd get soaked.
So it's worth paying a few more pence to get an inside seat if it's raining.
Absolutely.
Oh, dear.
Without a fast train service, Port Carlisle's trade and tourism rapidly faded. But there were still some people who clearly thought the port would continue to grow. This chapel was built after the locomotives left.
Just on the outskirts of the village here, and there's a lovely little chapel. Fairly simple building, just one long range really. There's a later extension on the side here. That lovely red brick there. and then these little lancet, these thin Gothic windows. It's not like a medieval parish church. It's not grand, it's not flamboyant. A lovely building nonetheless.
Named after the methodical way in which they carried out their Christian faith, the Methodists, under the leadership of John Wesley, originated in the 1700s.
What a wonderful building this is.
Historian Onyeka Nubia has researched Methodism's role in industrial Britain.
Everything that you see here is practical, straightforward, and workmanlike. And that tells us a lot about Methodism in the 19th century. Methodists came to places like this because they wanted to reach out and be part of the new growth of a new town. And this was a new town that they thought would grow.
So quite pioneering
Yeah.
as well. So there's this campaign of chapel building across the country.
Yeah. During the 19th century, 250 chapels like this were being built every year. This was a chapel that housed over 150 people. So we can see it's a congregation brimming with energy and excitement.
Yeah, and it's quite a small place, Port Carlisle. We expect 150 people to come and worship here. That's making a statement, isn't it?
And I think that we might see it here in some rural idyll as being separated from the world. But actually it's part of an international movement with international ideas.
Well, as was the port. Because, of
Absolutely.
course, you know, trade overseas, foreign trade, etc. It was all
Yeah.
part of that big network, wasn't it?
I think that the Methodists here thought that if we start here and this becomes a massive town, massive city like Liverpool, we will be the religion of this city. It's just that it didn't happen that way.
Yeah. Port Carlisle, it had boomed, but the reality was it was already starting to take a downturn. So trade was drying up, so there were people in genuine need now in the community.
Yeah, this is at a time when we didn't have social services, we didn't have public and state welfare. And so churches and chapels like this would have been the place of refuge for the poor, the needy, and the sick. Methodists were carrying out a social philanthropic purpose, as well as a religious and a theological one.
The new port of Silloth, just 9 miles down the coast, continued to flourish. And when a new rail viaduct across the Solway Firth opened in 1869, Port Carlisle was completely bypassed.
Port Carlisle is a startling story of boom to bust in little more than 30 years. It's a place that reminds us just how short this window of success was for the nation's canal system. So much investment, so much effort, and it was outdated so quickly. But here, it's left a charming coastal village with quite a tale to tell.